Hey everyone! I keep pumping out movies completely accidentally, and apparently there's no end in sight. With all this extra time to focus on one episode, one script, I can very easily fill an hour, evidently. Last time we got Kiba's episode and his summoning escapades. Dude ran into a self-described Sage of Dominion, a conqueror versus a liberator, as it were. Between Neji and Kiba's episodes so far, I've hoped to communicate how much growth they've had without necessarily showing everything, but still keeping it believable. Neji, we didn't actually see him actively partake in combat, it was just training and learning. Whereas with Kiba, we didn't see him train at all, but he did get a bit of combat. Between those two, I hope that helps communicate that even though I don't implicitly show something, that doesn't mean it didn't happen. In some cases, you'll have to wait and see how something has developed. I obviously didn't figure out the subtitles for last video. YouTube has a pretty easy method of uploading your transcript, and it will insert those at the correct points in the video. But, although I follow a script, I often go off-script for a little bit of in-the-moment flair. And that kind of thing makes my vocals misalign with the script, unless I went back and adjusted the script, which of course takes more time. I've had people few and far between actually complain about subtitles, so it's not at the top of my to-do list, but it's certainly a quality of life change that shouldn't be impossible. Anyway, more on point, Kiba overheard a meeting that seems impossible, right? Why would these kids return after 4 years, only to immediately plot the Kage's death? Some more clarity on that is needed, I think. But, also from the more minor plots of last episode, Sakura, Choji, and Shino finally learned about Kurenai's fate. A shocker that everyone withheld that information from them for as long as they did. Sakura also found the unconscious Jiraiya, who hasn't been conscious since his run-in with Danzo 4 years ago. Between him in a coma and Orochimaru taken out altogether, Tsunade was abruptly thrust into being the sole survivor of her team. The Sannin are actually an interesting set of characters for the world of Naruto. They're all apparently, in canon, near or at the level of Kage, and they're all a part of the same village? In canon, even if Hashirama distributed all the tailed beasts for a balance of power, Konoha still has this insane reoccurrence of extremely powerful ninja. Minato was so strong that only the writer could kill him. Anyway, I'm rambling. I'm sure you didn't all tune in to hear me bounce around like this. Let's get straight into this episode. It had been weeks since Shino returned to the village. In that time, he had told his family about his time away and about the seven tails that he hitched a ride with. In fact, it didn't stop where he got off and continued its flight north to parts unknown. But after telling his story, his father and the other able-bodied Aburame decided to make a pilgrimage to search for this great beast. Based off of Shino's story, they had no reason to doubt the powers they could gain by making the trip. But Shino had no idea where it was going, so they would be heading out with an unknown destination. The long and short of it was that Shino was now the de facto head of the clan in the village. He had grandparents and a couple great uncles that were still up and about that could do the clerical work, but when it came to village meetings, despite not being a jonin, these responsibilities were thrust onto him to attend. All in all, it wasn't as bad as it could have been. Without his family elders around to help out, he wouldn't have been able to do anything in the village or for missions. But so far, the Hokage had only assigned him and the others D and C rank missions or patrol tasks. Everyone, himself included, insisted that they were capable of much harder missions, but everyone were shut down immediately. Shino figured that the Hokage wanted them to properly acclimatize to their home again without disruptions like missions. But he also knew how few jonin the village had. The ratio of jonin to chunin to genin was now completely lopsided. It used to be about 20% Jonin to 50% Chunin to 30% Genin before the war on Iwa. Now it was closer to 5% Jonin, 65% Chunin, and still 30 Genin. Just as many Genin, a lot more Chunin, and barely any Jonin. His father even told him that of the Onbu that remained loyal, most had to unmask to help bolster the Jonin ranks on the harder missions. Clan heads were also going out on missions to fill the gap, and unfortunately there just weren't that many Chunin right now that had the talents to rise up to Jonin level. It was common knowledge that though Genin go through the Chunin exams to be considered for a promotion to become Jonin, there is a much different process. Not only do their ratio of A-rank missions completed have to equal 30% of all their missions, but they need to be approved by 5 other Jonin in the village. In the 4 years they'd spent away, the triumphant 12 inherited a disadvantage towards that goal, having obviously completed 0 missions in their time away. Only Shikamaru made it there. As much as Shino wanted to help balance this ratio, there was very little he had control over right now. He wondered why the Hokage wasn't pushing for them to do harder missions. Day 3. The Hokage building looked different since they'd rebuilt it, and Shino wondered if there were any other drastic changes in the village made in his absence. So whenever he had free time, he went up and down all the streets he navigated as a kid. There were certainly some changes, but not nearly as many as he expected in a 4-year gap of time. The village had expanded out a little bit, and he was seeing different faces now that the little kids he once knew had all become Genin as well. He was currently standing on a small stone bridge that arched over the smallest stream imaginable. He wondered why such construction even needed to happen for such a small stream, but perhaps the season was dry and it was normally more energetic than this. Psst! A voice came from his right. He didn't really pay it any heed, since he'd known Kiba and Neji had been following him for several streets now. Why they didn't just come out and talk to him was strange, and he wondered how far he could go before they finally took that next step to uncover themselves. Head bobbing backward to dodge a thrown rock, he glanced over at them in annoyance. If they were trying to hide, throwing rocks would not help their stealth. "What?" he asked without moving from the bridge. Their answer was Neji nodding his head for Shino to follow, and Kiba frantically waving his hands for him to join them in the shade of the building they hugged up against. "What do you want?" he asked again, pivoting in their direction, but they shushed him and Kiba held his fingers to his lips in an attempt to keep him quiet. If anyone else was on the street, they would have been able to see these two clear as day. Why noise was the fear for these two was beyond Shino. Sighing, he shook his head and slowly approached them, to the extreme displeasure of Kiba's growing excitement. "We can't talk here," Kiba whispered at him at last when he arrived beside them. "The woods!" While Neji and Kiba darted from cover to cover, Shino continued to walk plainly in their direction. Though Neji played along with Kiba's insanity, Shino could tell from the Hyuga's face that he was growing more and more annoyed with these antics. So it was Kiba that was at the heart of this dilemma. Shino always thought he could get along with Kiba since they both shared their lives with non-human creatures. But whatever Kiba went through in his time away left him slightly unhinged. Shino had to eat bugs, but maybe Kiba didn't really see people. It was taking him an extraordinarily long time to get used to civilization. At least, much longer than the rest of them. Once they were a sufficient distance from the village proper, Kiba pulled Shino into a bush so he could reveal the news. "You think," Shino muttered, "that Naruto wants to kill his own dad." "I know! It's insane!" Kiba whispered in agreement, nodding his head. "With just one Byakugan, I can't exactly do safe scouting," Neji explains. He's being quiet, but he's not playing along with hiding in a bush like Kiba was doing. We needed a tracker to follow up on Kiba's findings and confirm whether this was real. I don't really believe it either. Hinata has sworn, along with the rest of the Hyuga, to protect and defend the village and Hokage. With Hinata and Naruto in this barn, could they not sense any eavesdropper? Shino asks, confused as to the competency of his fellow classmates. This doesn't make much sense. They probably didn't think anyone would be in their neck of the woods, Kiba reasoned, nodding to himself as if that was enough to explain it all away. I'll do some investigating, but maybe run your logic by Shikamaru, because what you think makes sense doesn't, Shino tells Kiba. I'll come back at the end of the day with anything that I find. Following Kiba's instructions, Shino makes his way to the barn, masking the travel as a jaunt through the woods. Shino was sure after his time in the thick jungles beyond the ocean to the south, nothing would compare, but the powers that be took good care of those woods inside the village limits. The forest floor was lush with moss and fallen leaves, which was the perfect habitat for the bugs Shino loved to see thrive. Amongst the undergrowth, Shino carefully stepped around the various beetles, clambering around the damp, decomposing foliage. Their iridescent green shells twinkled in the sunlight, peering through small gaps in the tree's canopy. Butterflies fluttered all around him as they flitted gracefully from flower to flower. Their vibrant wings were painted in shades of yellow and black. Ducking under an intricately woven web, Shino glances up at the spider and keeps an inner checklist of which bugs now populate these woods. At the barer spots around the feet of trees, he saw pillbugs and red ants scurrying busily about. The ants were nearly a swarm, there were so many. Passing by another small stream revealed another sub-ecosystem, rife with a new set of little critters. Shaking his head, Shino takes a mental note to return here later so he can observe them all in close detail. Returning to the task at hand, Shino centers himself at the coordinates of the barn. Except, there's nothing here. Kiba and Neji had returned to the spot to see a barn. Even if Kiba's word was shaky at best, Neji certainly wouldn't lie about this. There was no sign of a building ever being here. It just looked like the rest of the forest, though admittedly a rather large space without trees. Throwing an arc of 3 shuriken, expecting the structure to be cloaked in some way, Shino was disappointed when they flew unopposed and landed in the grass in the very spot Kiba said they had gathered. Retrieving his shuriken, Shino looked about and spread his bugs around, finding himself falling for Kiba's paranoia. But as his bugs outstretched, they found nothing. No one spying on him. Nothing. Recalling them back to himself, Shino sighs and returns to town. If he couldn't find a trace of the aggressors, maybe there was some evidence in or around the Hokage building. In order to attempt such an assassination, you need to have a plan to get to your target. So, Shino dispersed his bugs in and around the Hokage building to search for any structural flaws that an offender could exploit. Masking his scouting, he placed himself at the top of the cliffs above the Kage heads, pretending to be taking it easy or meditating. Not knowing the layout of the new building himself, it took several hours of slow scouting by his bugs to get a map of the entire building. Just as his father had said, there couldn't have been any Anbu around, since his bugs would most certainly have been detected by now. As it was, only village officials wandered the halls of the Kage building, with the Hokage presumably in his office alone. Of all times to attempt such an assassination, it seemed now would be it. However, he found no structural flaws. Hinata might be privy to the missing Anbu, and maybe Ino. Even Naruto could have, depending on how much Lord Hokage had been willing to share. Blinking, Shino wondered why he was leaning into this plot so much, despite having no information yet. Doubling down on his focus, he finished a sweep of the building before concluding that nothing was amiss. Recalling his bugs, he wondered how he could possibly catch them in the act of conspiring, because he didn't just want to call it a day and assume Kiba was delusional. As they slowly trickled back to him, one of his bugs passing a door heard muffling shouting on its other side, and he had to peek into the Hokage's office. He did not mean to spy, just to make sure there was nothing amiss, though he also recognized the risk in doing so. Lord Hokage was known for his sensory abilities. If for some reason he hadn't noticed the sudden deluge of bugs descending onto his building, he would certainly notice even one entering his office. Thinning the chakra signal to the scouting bug as much as he can, Shino wills it to enter the room from the gap under the door. There doesn't appear to be anyone in the room other than Minato, but he's talking. To himself? The beetle crawls further into the room, crawling up a wall for a better vantage point. "It's preposterous!" Minato mutters, kicking his desk so his chair rolls backward and into the wall. Launching to his feet, Minato runs his hands through his hair before slamming them on the desk. "These pests keep cropping up all over the place!" Freezing his beetle in place, Shino's horrified that Lord Forth's talking about his bugs. "I already knew about this stupid plot," Lord Hokage declares, shaking his head as he looks down at his desk. "I don't know why these cretins think they can somehow overpower me." Shino's beetle picks up on the presence of another that's hidden away somewhere, and he wonders if that's who the Hokage is speaking to. Otherwise, he just sounds like an insane person yelling at himself. But Shino's lone beetle doesn't have the juice to alone detect the whereabouts of the other person. Even the information he's receiving is but a whisper without the full network of bugs working together. "But I'm done with it," Lord Hokage states. "I don't care who they are, but when I learn who they are, maybe I'll just put an end to them there and then. Scare other would-be usurpers from doing this again. I'm sick of it." The communication from his beetle suddenly ends, and Shino jumps to his feet from the surprise. Did someone else enter the room or something? With just the one beetle, it could only focus on one thing at a time. Could Kiba have been telling the truth after all, if there was an actual plot against the Hokage? He was a little distressed that the Hokage would suggest striking fear into citizens to prevent resistance. Swallowing, Shino collects himself and tries to think of an excuse if he's caught by whoever squished that beetle. "Shino!" A voice echoes behind him as he twirls to face it. He sees Naruto just a few feet away. "That's my spot." Sighing with the relief that it was only Naruto that broke his concentration, Shino attempts to retain his composure regardless. "Shino?" Another voice echoes behind him again. Spinning, Shino finds himself face to face with Lord Hokage. "Why are you spying on me?" Lord Forth asks with a raised eyebrow, unfurling his hand to give Shino back his lone beetle, still alive. I did not mean to," Shino stutters, but the Hokage's attention has already pulled away as he looks past Shino at his own son. He smiles faintly at Naruto. "My son," he mutters quietly, and even Naruto's eyes have turned softer. Before they approach each other, the Hokage's face suddenly changes and he vanishes without a trace. Naruto's head jerks in the direction the Hokage likely vanished to, and his eyes have gone cold again. "Go away, Shino!" It only took 6 months for his beetles to adapt all the techniques that he wanted from the mutated bugs. He even used them to protect the village while they thought of a better way to protect themselves. Like others already told him, no one was willing to learn even some basic jutsu to ward off the more territorial animals and bugs in the area. So he set to helping them craft weaponry as well as build fortifications. But at the end of the day, it was all just a band-aid. None of these solutions were sustainable. None of them would last forever. And after they helped him so much, Shino felt guilty if he were just to leave without a permanent solution for them. It would be another 6 months of mulling over his options while protecting them from all manner of beasties. One quote-unquote easy solution would be removing the tailed beast from the area, but he had no idea how to get it to move. It either couldn't move or didn't, because in all the time he'd been there, it didn't budge an inch. The villagers even told him that it had been sitting in that river for years without moving, before Shino came along. He knew that if the beast did take off and relocate, the village would no longer be protected from the civilization they've been ostracized from. However, they assured him that without such a massive beast to threaten, tensions would lessen all around. They were both very confident that their local issues would go away and that the rest of the people would not rise to violence. At the very least, they didn't want Shino worrying about their own problems. He had tested his limits numerous times with it and learned that with his beetles fully populated inside of him, the tailed beast indeed ignored him like any other villager. So Shino no longer needed to consume those bugs, thankfully. He thought that maybe from the ground he was too far for his voice to reach the beast's head. The water displacement its body created also produced a lot of churning water that drowned out Shino's voice. However, on the far side of the river was a cliff face that stood roughly as tall as the beast itself. Picking a day for adventure, he scaled the cliff to a point where the beast would undoubtedly hear him. He tries asking it several questions, such as, "Where are you from?" or, "How long has it been in this spot?" But the monster ignores him completely. Shrugging, Shino sits at the top of the cliff and stares at the beast. Last time he had a violent interaction with it, he was injured. This time he was confident he could escape if he annoyed it or some such. But it still takes weeks of persistently returning to the cliff's edge and staring at the beast, and eventually it responds to him. "What you want, puny?" it asked at long last. "You could live wherever you want. Why here?" Shino asks it, having carefully crafted his question in all the time he'd been waiting for it to respond, because he knew it could. "Hashirama," the monster answered menacingly. "Enslave my kind. I flee." He has been dead for 100 years. Shino lies slightly. It had actually only been about 50 years from what he knows, but he didn't think 50 years was enough time for a beast that's been around for as long as this one. The beast's head spins left to right. "Dead?" Suddenly leaping from the river, the beast lands atop the cliff beside Shino, showering rubble down onto the river below as the cliff sinks from its titanic weight. Nearly losing his own footing, Shino looks down and watches massive boulders cascade to the ground below, splashing into the river. He's too far to see how the villagers are reacting to this development. Its 6 tail wings spring to life and start fluttering, picking the great beast up off the ground. Without thinking, Shino jumps to its back, near all the winged tails, and goes along for the ride. Far to the north is a vast expanse of water, but in every other direction, it's just endless, dense jungle. Had he traveled on foot, it would have taken ages to get anywhere, and he would have been blind all the while at ground level. At the very least, he could travel with the beast until it noticed him, or brought to somewhere recognizable. Sure enough, it begins to pick up speed and fly north, and it's only minutes before it's reached the great sea that was barely visible from the cliff top. Resting on thick chitinous scales, Shino hopes that they're tough enough that the beast can't feel him there. Settling in for the long haul, Shino wonders where the great beast is heading. He had only spent a year in the bug's paradise, but he learned more than he possibly could have ever known in that time. He was leaving without regrets. After 2 days of travel, Shino was exhausted. He had to maintain consciousness or risk being jostled off to fall to the water below. Because the beast flew so fast, he figured crossing the sea would take a couple hours, but it stretched on and on. But as a result of this, he didn't prepare any food for the trip, so he was tired and hungry. And it came as a great shock to him when the beast suddenly just crashed down to the earth, splashing into a great lake and submerging Shino as a result. It was all he could do just to swim back to the surface, let alone figure out what just happened. Luckily, he was close to shore and managed to climb out above the water to get to safety. When he turned back to the beast, he noticed it settle in so deep that only its head was visible above the water. Raising his arms in confusion, Shino can only really shake his head at the beast's decision-making processes. He tries talking to it again, but it completely ignores him. Batting a hand at it, Shino's growing hunger takes command and he goes foraging for food. He figures they were in the air for so long that he must be on the continent that he knows, but that still doesn't mean that he knows where he is. If he is closer to civilization, it shouldn't take too much searching to find a settlement or, optimistically, a large village nearby. Other than the beast that brought him here, Shino stands alone in the midst of an expansive and still unfamiliar landscape. Around him stretches a seemingly endless sea of gently rolling hills, the long grass upon them gently swaying in the breeze. Interspersed among the hills are clusters of small woods, scraggly groves of trees that offer brief, cool respite from the sun's glare. His journey is not without its challenges. The terrain being uneven and obviously without a clear path leads Shino to blindly wading through dense patches of grass and stumbling over hidden rocks. There are also little groupings of wild garlic in the shade as well. Picking everything up without discrimination, Shino lunges at the chance of granting his stomach some sort of reprieve. After some lengthy, albeit random traveling around the area, he eventually comes across a rather large camp of tents. Sighing with relief that he's found some civilization, Shino approaches, though with caution. As he draws closer, he realizes an odd familiarity with the people wandering around the camp. It was the Uzumaki clan. Since they visited during the Chunin exams, he was under the impression that they were friendly to any outside and approached on those grounds. The little tent town had no guards, and so he passed into its midst without resistance. Children ran by him without a worry in the world, their long red hair trailing down the entirety of their backs, and even older adults nodded recognition at him as they weaved thick braids into their overflowing manes and did not stop him as he walked. It was a very strange feeling that no one was afraid of him or that there were no rudimentary watchmen set up to alert of visitors. When the next person passes by and nods a smiling greeting at him, he gets their attention and they stop to converse. He finds out that their camp has been set up in the Land of Tea, south of the Land of Fire. The peninsula they were on was vast, and it would still take Shino at the very least a month to get home if he traveled on foot from here. And without any prodding on his part, he's invited into a marquee, one of the largest tents in the encampment where all the cooking is done to feed the clan. Here, they freely feed him and invite him to take part in their conversations. He's just blown away by how inviting they all are, and his leaf headband aside, he hasn't once been asked who he is. Everyone around him has grown their hair out completely. Some of the women have their long hair nestled in their lap while they sit, while the men's overlong hair drapes down their backs and sits carelessly on the ground beneath. A girl roughly his age sidles beside him at the long table that he's eating at. By contrast to everyone else he's seen so far, her hair is short, but still reaching past halfway down her back. This table is long and curves around in a horseshoe pattern, with the cooking being done in the middle. The girl tells him that Aki, their leader, has assigned her to guide him around and make staying with them very easy. They have a good relationship with all the greater nations of the shinobi world. However, their relations with the leaf stretches longer than any other, and so they will always welcome any leaf ninja or citizen of the Land of Fire to stay with them. Feeling a swell of warmth and welcome in his heart, Shino smiles thanks at her and their hospitality as a whole. Curious herself, she asks him if he's from a named clan in the Leaf, and he nods and says he's part of the Aburame clan. Upon mention of his house name, she noticeably becomes slightly rigid and actively leans away from him. "You're one of those bug people?" she asks, involuntarily cringing at his identity. "I hate bugs!" Nodding, Shino tells her that's actually a pretty normal reaction, but he's just as human as anyone else. "Still, you," she murmurs. I'll try to get past it." Despite her stark reaction to who he was, she still invited him to speak with their traveling council. Sitting in this council were Aki, the current leader of the clan. His wild mane was perhaps the most bold of them all, and Shino wondered if that showing had something to do with why the man was the clan head. There was a rather young, pretty woman, who everyone referred to only as the Master of Seals, who had tattoos all across her skin. Her long hair was split into 2 thick braids and sat on stands to avoid touching the ground. There were 3 people, collectively referred to as the Trade Masters, and there was an ancient old woman that Shino couldn't believe was still alive. Her skin looked paper thin and pale, and her eyes didn't even look like they were open. Though her hair was long, it had paled a little in her ancient age, but Shino would never mistake it as any color other than red. No one spoke to her in this meeting with them, nor did she speak or show any sign of being alive other than sitting unassisted. And it was in this meeting that especially the Trade Masters showed keen interest in his bug abilities. Aki was very charismatic and gentle with the prodding when he asked not for the secrets of his family, but rather for some history for how his family came to be this way. As the heir to the head of his clan, Shino felt responsible to not share such dire information, but Aki assured him time and time again that he does not wish to force Shino to break any vows of silence on his family's secrets. Shino tells him that he would need to think on which information was specifically allowed to share versus not share. And this is good enough for Aki, encouraging Shino to take all the time that he needs. The Uzumaki clan are collectors of knowledge, and trade this knowledge with all the great nations for further knowledge. As such, he agrees that family secrets certainly need to stay secret so that opponent nations cannot take advantage of each other. The Uzumaki clan were absolutely neutral on that front, and would never share information that would incriminate one of the 5 great villages. These were their customers, so sharing such dangerous information was actually just a net loss for everyone, as they'd risk losing both opposing villages in the trade. It was in their very best interest to hold on to it all themselves. And indeed, for several clans that held hidden abilities, the Uzumaki clan had become archivists to the secrets, such that if a clan was ever annihilated or died out, they could revive the clan with that knowledge. They wanted only for balance in the world, and for everyone to enjoy their seals. It was from them that all the Jinchuriki inherited such strong seals for their tailed beasts. However, despite all these reassurances, Shino had been taught his whole life not to share the information with anyone, and he wasn't about to break that rule now, regardless of who he was speaking to. It is with great responsibility that a named clan passes along this crucial information. In fact, it astounds Shino that there have already been families to trust the Uzumaki clan so much with their generations-long secrets. Aki cites most recently the trade of the puppeteering jutsu from the Land of Wind. This was a hiden technique of their village. Though other nations had bad copies of this technique, the hiden form was certainly the most reliable. And the trade they made with the Land of Wind was so fortuitous that they agreed to allow the Uzumaki clan to trade that puppeteering knowledge with others. Shino crooks his head at the suggestion that they would so willingly make public one of their secrets. How is the trade so lucrative to allow such information to go public? With seemingly infinite patience for Shino's decision-making, Aki invites him to travel along with them until he makes up his mind. From the Land of Tea, they meant to ferry east to the island chains south of the Land of Water, before circling around to the Land of Woods, east of the Land of Fire. If he stuck around long enough, they would inevitably get closer to the Land of Fire anyway, so there would be no harm in sticking around. And so Shino was given a little tent of his own to stay in as he adopted the slow-moving, nomadic life of the Uzumaki clan. He had no real intent to actually share any of his family's information, and told Aki as much. He did not want to lead him along for a year of traveling only to say no anyway. But Aki reassured him that whether he shared the information was inconsequential. As a member of the Leaf, he was akin to family to the Uzumaki clan. The girl whom had been assigned to him eventually introduced herself as Karin, and wasn't nearly as nice as she initially let on. She repeatedly grew tired of how slow and thoughtful he was with the children, or how much he volunteered to help disassemble and reassemble the tents. She thought her helping him would save her from those tasks. He would even stop to inspect flowers, or bugs, or even small woodland creatures, and all of these pauses really irritated her. However much he told her that she just didn't need to be at his constant beck and call, she never seemed to completely leave him alone. Confused by her life choices, he still found himself learning a lot from her and the clan as a whole. They had developed hundreds of types of sealing jutsu. While he knew them best for the sealing of tailed beasts, that only encompassed their most powerful of seals. They also had so many lower grade seals that they used for all manner of application. Smaller villages that were unconnected from the ninja world were also afraid of non-tangible threats, such as curses or possessions, old-fashioned fears. For these non-issues, Shino was surprised to see the Uzumaki clan treat them seriously, providing inert paper seals to the unknowing recipients. He felt a little disappointed that the Uzumaki would engage in such deception, but Karin told him that these backwater villages would accept nothing less and couldn't afford anything more. If it helped to put their mind at ease, why was Shino so against it? Let them live in their beliefs and get occasional charms to ward off the spirits. And occasionally they would actually come across actual afflictions that the restorative seals could undo. As part of their field medicine, they could apply seals to wounds like bandages, and the seals would enhance chakra circulation to encourage a faster healing of the wound. The Master of Seals, in fact, could perform these healing jutsu without the physical seals. As much as Karin was grossed out by Shino, she also was not shy in her disdain of the Master of Seals. To her, of all the Uzumaki clan's traditions, the Master of Seals appointment was the most detestable. They masked the offer as a blessing, when in actuality the Master of Seals essentially became a slave to every whim of the clan head. She no longer had a life, nor would she ever again, and she'd been brainwashed into thinking that was a good idea. For every village they passed through, they would leave protective seals to mask the village's presence, or even as offensive traps for predators. These were granted free of charge, as they were very easy to make. The young Uzumaki kids that ran around had various chains around their necks that Shino thought at first to be just necklaces. Karin told him that the chains locked away the children's chakra while worn. This wasn't a form of punishment, but to allow the children to understand the importance of moderation and the effectiveness of their seals. While the Uzumaki clan didn't raise ninja, everyone was still extremely capable with chakra. Though there were very few known Uzumaki out in the world, the ones that were known were particularly powerful when compared to the Uzumaki clan members. She pauses on this claim, citing that there are 3 people she knows of that are monsters in their own right. She counts one person, quote-unquote Ransai, on her index finger, mutters Naruto's name on her middle finger, and then says, and Nagato, when she lands on her ring finger. Other than those 3, most Uzumaki are about as powerful as one another, she explains, nodding to herself. I have at least 10 times more chakra than you, and I'm just average. Hopefully Naruto will turn out okay, she continues. Nagato is still allowed to visit the clan, but only in special circumstances. I've only met him twice, and he made me feel tiny. She also mutters how the other one's flat out banned from association with the clan ever again, but does not explain why. I've never heard that name before, Shino says, repeating Ransai. That's not his name, Karin mutters. I'm not supposed to talk about him. That's what we call him. Call it a title. Then I suppose you call Naruto a monster because he's a Jinchuriki? Shino concludes. He'd be a monster without that, Karin answers dismissively. If he were a pure Uzumaki, he'd be weaker than what he is. I only saw him once a year ago, and he immediately made me think of Nagato. I'm not sure if I want to meet these other monsters then, Shino joked, because despite her description of Naruto, he never saw him as anything more than a classmate with an unwieldy beast locked inside him. The only shame that Naruto has is that gross yellow hair, Karin said it dismissively, combing a hand through her scarlet hair. Be glad that you know the nice monster with bad hair. He also learned that between the ages of 12 to 16, all clan members were encouraged to join one of the great villages to learn what life was like on the outside. And if they chose to stay in their village of choice, then that basically left an ambassador for the Uzumaki clan for future visits. But if they returned to the Uzumaki clan, they could help continue the family traditions. Karin had reached that age range herself and was meant to be dropped off in Konoha, but the sudden attack by the Akatsuki put all their plans on hold. And because the clan took so long to get around, she knew she might age out before getting her chance to return there. Long ago, when their leader Aki was still a boy, the Uzumaki clan had a nation of their own, and ninja that they cultivated. But they found that they were under attack nearly constantly. As they fended off one attack, another group would take the chance to leap on them and attempt to steal secrets. Both their known Fuinjutsu, sealing techniques, and their blood was highly coveted. The worst raiders would try to steal children so they could brainwash them against the Uzumaki clan. And those after the sealing techniques would try to steal them and ransom off village leadership for the knowledge. This all met a head when a particularly large force attacked that the Uzumaki clan knew they'd be unable to fend off. So their warriors stayed behind to misdirect the attackers and buy as much time as possible for everyone else to escape with as much as they could carry. Since then, they never dared to return to their ruined land and chose to always stay moving and be friendly with as many nations as possible. At least this way, if one decided to turn on them, the rest would hopefully rise to their defense. Their own neutrality was now their strongest defense. One night, Shino awoke to the sound of several men walking past his tent. It was extremely late, and he was sure everyone slept at this hour, yet there were several who just passed by. He was sure that there was discussion within the clan that occurred behind closed doors, because no family could possibly be this peaceful. So, out of curiosity, he dispersed some beetles to investigate the disturbance, and they tracked 6 men to the council's pavilion. Quietly, he exited his tent and stole through the night, keeping hidden. Landing in the lower branches of a nearby tree, Shino laid across the branch and looked into the pavilion to see why there might be a commotion at this time. If there had been an attack of some sort, he'd certainly be ready and willing to fend against it. He could only see the legs and lower backs of the men from his vantage point, so no faces to identify. Slowly, he lowered himself to hang from the branch so he could get a better look, but even while hanging, he could only see their bare and broad backs. Before he could lower himself further, he was shocked from a sudden punch from Karin that landed in a very unfortunate part of his body. Reeling from the strike, Shino fell from the branch and crumpled to the ground. Even while he struggled to regain his breath, he turned his head to look toward the pavilion, but there was no one there now. As if Karin's uncouth attack on him scared them all away. "Sneaking around in the middle of the night?" Karin asked, pushing her glasses up in annoyance. "I'm not supposed to be your guard, you idiot." Shino could only groan as he slowly recovered and lifted himself to a kneeling position. Even while Karin berated him for wandering around like a creep, he glanced around for any sign of where they vanished to. Regarding Karin carefully, Shino cautiously rose to his feet at long last. "You could have simply said my name," Shino told her, his turn to be annoyed. "I am a tracker too, you moron," she said, her demeanor completely hostile. "I watched you do your perverted poses in the tree. Any creep who does something weird like that is gonna earn a punch." "Ugh," Shino grunted, turning away from Karin and returning to his tent, despite her continued attempts to insult him. "Just what I'd expect from someone who likes bugs so much. Creep," she echoed as he shut his tent and attempted to tune her out. There was something peculiar about the men in that pavilion, but Shino just couldn't put his finger on it. Everything was business as usual the next day, and the next week, and even the next month. Why did they come particularly on that one day? Or did his spying scare them away to conduct their meetings elsewhere? Nevertheless, Shino kept his beetles on high alert while he slept, since he wasn't using them much during the day. If there was even a hint of any further disturbances, he would spring to action again. He hated the idea of a nomadic clan that claimed neutrality to be doing shady business behind the scenes. Sure enough, following his diligence, he was eventually awoken again, and when he exited his tent to investigate, he saw a lone man walking slowly between the tents, looking at them all. Creeping in the man's direction, Shino meant to keep a certain distance from him before Karin's familiar claws reached from the darkness and grabbed him by the coat to pull him behind cover. Before he could voice resistance, he saw a finger against her lips and realized she was helping him hide. She mouthed one word to him, and it looked most like Ransai, one of the monsters of the Uzumaki clan, specifically one that had been banned from their number. Peeking out from cover, Shino watches the man check several tents, before settling on one particularly lavish one. "He's at the Master of Seal's tent," Shino whispered urgently to Karin, conjuring his beetles to be ready for a fight. "Gross," Karin commented, nearly unable to push past the swarming bugs. No time left to hide, Shino watched the tall man grab the tent from its roof and forcefully pull it down, collapsing it on the Master of Seals. Shino's beetles all ignited with fire as he leapt from cover and charged at the man, launching his living fireball at him. Turning to face Shino, the man had a Sharingan in one eye and a Byakugan in the other, and both were activated. He simply waved his hand, and all of Shino's beetles lost their fire, as he felt his chakra through them being drained away. "Intruder!" Shino yelled as he leapt through the air to engage the man in taijutsu, but the man answered with one strike to Shino's sternum. Feeling all the strength in his arms leave him, Shino lands to the ground unsettled. His beetles form a wall between him and the man, who reaches through them as if they weren't there at all, and picks Shino up by his collar. "Bugs?" the man asks as his Byakugan eyes scanned Shino up and down. "Too many weaknesses." And in the same moment that he released Shino, his hand pulled back and shot right back in for a second strike. This time he threw a horizontal chop into Shino's side, just below the ribs. That was a particularly dense housing location for his bugs. The strike doubled as a liver shot for extreme pain against Shino, as well as destroying a sizable hive spot for his beetle's breeding ground. Wheezing, Shino held his side with one hand and attempted to create a distance against the man. He should have taken Karin's warning seriously. This man was a monster. As he leapt backward, the man just took one step forward towards Shino and reached with his other hand to catch him by the foot. Weaving jutsu with just one hand, the man spun to launch Shino a real distance. "Earth-style, stone-spike jutsu," the man said as he released Shino to launch through the camp. Leaping to his aid, Aki caught him in his arms before Shino smashed into this newly erected wall of spikes. "You've done well, Shino. Aki acknowledged kindly as he stepped toward the man alone. "Thank you for protecting my family." From Shino's blurry state, he was barely able to track what followed. The Master of Seals leapt from her tent in an attempt to place a hand on Ransai. Though he caught her hand, it was enough time for Aki to close the distance and protect the Master of Seals from harm. As the leader of the clan engaged with the walking calamity, Shino lost consciousness. When he awoke the next day, he was alone. The Uzumaki camp had picked up camp and moved on without him. Except, most of the tents lay in shambles now. He wondered why they felt like they needed to create space from him, but maybe he was dead weight and they needed to leave as quickly as possible? Grunting as he sat up, Shino opened his jacket to look at his side and saw a black and blue bruise stretch across his entire side, from just below the arm down to his hip. If he had to guess, he had a couple broken ribs too, as it hurt on the inhale. Shaking his head at the blur that was his night, he slowly built up to standing before doing a proper survey to see. Sitting not 100 feet away was the seven-tailed beast. In the last few years, with the Uzumaki clan, he had moved far from the lake that the beast had hid itself in. Did it follow him here? "You lie," it told him, now aware that he was actually awake. "Hashirama dead, but strong one still." "That man last night," Shino wheezed against his injury, "is comparable to Hashirama?" "I tried to squish it. Little mice run." Ah, now it made sense. The Uzumaki clan fled the tailed beast, and maybe it was attracted to this spot because it sensed a powerful concentration of chakra. Or maybe just one person. In the commotion of Ransai's threat, they probably didn't spare time to pick up what wasn't considered essential. Shino couldn't blame them, although there was no way they knew this tailed beast wasn't going to attack Shino as well. "Pest!" the beast said, lunging forward and stabbing one of its arms into the ground. Diving from a nearby bush, Karin screamed as she barely dodged the blow. No, she's no pest," Shino shouted in her defense, waving an arm on his good side to get the beast's attention. However, it didn't have eyes in the conventional sense, and he could never tell where it was looking at any given time. It attempted one more strike at her, and after his continued protests, its head spun back and forth a couple times before it stopped altogether. "You're friends with that thing?" Karin screams, terrified. "Not exactly," Shino admits, looking up at the monster. I'm neutral at the very best. Why didn't you leave with the rest of your clan?" "I was caught in the crossfire," Karin explains, "because I was trying to protect you. And then when I woke up, that monster was standing over me." At mention of monster, the beast's head swiveled several more times as it leaned closer to Karin and she squealed in return. "I'm going back to Konoha," Shino announced, looking up at the beast and wondering if it's ready to settle in for another few years or if it'll take off again. "Great! I have no idea where my clan is. I guess I have to go with you," Karin declares, inviting herself to follow along. A nearby tree branch snaps, drawing Shino's attention for a moment. Falling to the ground, a squirrel the size of a large dog landed and sprinted into the woods. Suddenly lifting off the ground, the tailed beast began to take off again. "Perfect!" Shino shouted, leaping to its back again, refocusing himself. Looking down to Karin, he shouted for her to join him, but all she did was scream in terror, and before he could explain anything, she was miles in the distance. "More little mice!" the beast hissed as it flew. Was it hunting powerful individuals? Perhaps whatever Hashirama did to the tailed beasts created this concentrated rage. Shino only hoped that the beast was flying in the right direction. Hopefully the beast would land down near Konoha. Shino thought that his family would enjoy mutated bugs in the same way that he did. Looking backward one last time, he's confident that Karin will find her way back to the clan, being a tracker as well. He felt kind of careless leaving her behind, but it was she who chose not to get any closer. "I don't need your protection, Inoichi, but thanks for the offer," Minato said, smiling with amusement and patting Inoichi on the shoulder for his suggestion. "You can attend to your other duties while I'm here." "As you say, Lord Fourth," Inoichi answered, providing a short, respectful bow before leaving the hall to do exactly what Minato suggested. It was cold here, in the darkest reaches of the Konoha jails. The floor is stained with grime and soot, and the smell of decay lingers heavily in the air. The cells here are small, barely larger than a cramped closet, barely able to accommodate an adult. They're constructed from thick, rotting wooden planks and bound with rusted iron bands, which are so tightly fastened that even a thin blade could not slip through the cracks. These cells are not accessed by a door, sealed completely from the outside unless the warden were to use a jutsu known only to him to dismantle the bars. The cell floor is cold, wet, uneven stone. This wing is assigned to only the most heinous criminals, who are meant to live in constant discomfort while jailed. They force prisoners into uncomfortable, contorted positions, making it impossible to stand or stretch. This space was built with just one person in mind. One who had once been a paragon of leadership for the village. One who had fallen more from grace than any other in the history of the village, except perhaps Madara Uchiha. Approaching the only occupied cell, Minato looked down at its occupant in silence. He rifles through his pockets as if he's misplaced something and takes his time to look for it. In the cell, Danzo sits heavily bound and sealed to prevent any modicum of an uprising ever again. His execution was stayed at Minato's order, since no one knew how to wake Jiraiya, and it was Danzo that put him in that state. On that topic, Minato voices the exact question as he had several times before. "What did you do to Jiraiya?" But Danzo returns with only silence. Kneeling to eye level with the old man, Minato threatens him with something worse than blindness if he refuses to come clean. "Patience has run out, Danzo," Minato tells him. "You have 72 hours to make up your mind." Finally pulling out what he was searching for, Minato holds a piece of folded paper in his hand. He considers it for a moment, before slipping it again into his pocket. "We are each the masters of our own fate. Don't let this be the end of yours." And that's the end of today's episode. Boy, oh boy. What a crazy crossing of paths for Shino to stumble across the Uzumaki clan? Unlike the other free-tailed beasts who stick to their zones, the Seven-Tails seems to have an agenda. It remembers Hashirama for some reason. Maybe the village's history of this great hero that formed it is dappled with some darkness. We'll explore more of that as we get closer to the greater plot. Because of the way canon is structured, I don't know if Kishimoto actually had the Sage of Six Paths planned out, or had any thoughts beyond the first Kage forming these various ninja outfits. I'm not saying he was a terrible writer, not by any stretch, simply that some writers have their entire stories planned out from day one, and others know the start and end, and basically just make it up as they go along. Quite frankly, that does sound haphazard and dangerous, but it truly works for some. I'm pretty sure Jim Butcher, author of The Dresden Files, didn't have any of his books planned out when he first started. In fact, I know that. And yet here he is with like 17 books into his ongoing story, and it's an absolutely fantastic read. But anyway, before I got off on that tangent, I'm just saying that I want to fill out some of the more blank spaces of Kishimoto's lore. Giving the tailed beasts actual roles instead of calling them monsters and implying that they're of intelligent minds is one of the things I've obviously been working to do. I can't promise to give all the tailed beasts such attention, but I'll certainly try. And what kind of mischief are the Uzumaki clan up to? Is Shino actually a friend to the Seven Tails? What was Minato doing talking to Danzo? So many things. But alas, I've outdone myself again, and I seriously need to figure out how to end this thing. Oh, wait! I have an idea. The sky's the limit.